March 1921. The Gulf of Finland is frozen solid.
Yeah, completely frozen over.
It is a bleak, unforgiving landscape of just jagged white ice stretching for miles toward the horizon.
Right.
And across this treacherous frozen expanse, the Red Army is advancing. Picture the visual for a moment. You have thousands of soldiers wrapped in white camouflage smocks marching directly into a blinding snowstorm.
Wow. It is a brutal scene.
They are pushing forward toward the Kronstadt naval base. That is the massive, heavily armed fortress island that guards the sea approaches to Petrograd, and the heavy guns of that fortress are currently firing right at them.
Yeah, point blank.
Artillery shells are cutting down whole columns of Red Army soldiers. The explosions are just shattering the thick ice beneath their feet, plunging men in heavy winter gear into the freezing black water below.
It is a total nightmare.
The fighting is savage. It actually culminates on March 17th, which happens to be the 50th anniversary of the Paris Commune.
Right, the historical weight there is huge.
Exactly. By the time the fortress finally falls, thousands of men on both sides are dead. And, well, we are embarking on a deep dive into this exact moment because the men firing the artillery at the Red Army from behind the walls of that fortress, they were the Kronstadt sailors.
Yeah.
These were the very men who had been the vanguard of the October Revolution just 4 years prior.
And this forces us to confront, a fundamental question about the trajectory of the Soviet state.
Right.
We have to ask, was this event a genuine working-class uprising against a degenerated dictatorship? Or was it a harsh necessity in defense of an isolated worker state, like an absolute crisis which forced the Bolsheviks to radically change their entire course?
And that is the overarching narrative arc we are tracing today. We have pulled from a massive stack of sources to get to the bottom of this.
We really have.
We are looking at Leon Trotsky's later reflections on the military and political crisis, Vladimir Lenin's original pamphlets from the period, contemporary resolutions drafted by the sailors themselves, and extensive historical and political analysis from the World Socialist website.
Right, and we will use all of that to explore the complete breakdown of the Peasant-Worker Alliance.
Yeah, the blood on the ice of Kronstadt and the 3 world historical decisions made at the 10th Party Congress in Moscow. That Congress was convening at the exact same time the island was burning.
But look, we need to establish the objective reality of the country itself before we can evaluate those decisions.
Yeah, the baseline.
The year is 1921. The civil war against the white armies and foreign interventionists is technically over, but Russia is left as an economic and demographic wasteland.
The statistics of this wasteland are just staggering. Think about daily life in a city like Petrograd.
It was grim.
The population had plummeted from over 2.5 million down to roughly 700,000. People were actually dismantling their own wooden houses and burning their furniture just to survive the freezing winters.
Because there was no fuel.
None. The official bread ration was down to 2 ounces a day. 20 million people were dead across the country from combat, typhus, and starvation.
And industry had almost entirely collapsed.
Right, the factories were empty, there was no raw material. The working class that actually made the revolution in 1917 had been physically decimated.
Yeah, its most dedicated members were either dead on the battlefields or they had been absorbed into the sprawling state administration just to keep the government functioning.
And running this ruined economy was a system known as war communism.
Which we need to be clear about. War communism was a regime of sheer emergency. It meant the total suppression of markets, the severe militarization of labor, and crucially, the forcible requisitioning of grain from the peasantry.
Right.
The state had to feed the starving cities in the Red Army, and there was no regular market mechanism left to accomplish that.
Think of war communism as a medical tourniquet.
Oh, that is a good way to put it.
You apply a tourniquet to stop the bleeding and save a patient's life during a massive physical trauma. In this case, the trauma was the Civil War. If you do not apply the tourniquet, well, the patient bleeds out and dies immediately.
Right.
But if you leave a tourniquet on too long, it begins to cause necrosis in the limbs, the tissue starts to die, you save the life, but you lose the arm.
Exactly.
By late 1920, the tourniquet of war communism was causing necrosis across the entire Russian countryside.
Yeah.
The requisitioning detachments, these armed groups of workers who would go into villages and physically seize the surplus grain, they were bleeding the rural economy dry. They were taking not just the surplus, but often the seed grain needed for the very next harvest.
And, the peasantry had tolerated these requisitioning detachments as long as the white armies posed an active military threat.
Oh, right, because the whites meant the return of the old landlords.
Exactly. It meant the loss of the land the peasants had just seized during the revolution. But with the whites definitively defeated, that threat evaporated.
So the patience ran out.
Completely. The peasants were no longer willing to surrender their grain at gunpoint to a state that could offer them absolutely no manufactured goods, no tools, and no clothing in return.
Which brings us directly to the Tambov uprising. Tambov was a province south of Moscow, heavily agricultural. The countryside quite literally caught fire.
It was a massive insurgency.
Tens of thousands of armed peasants rose up in an insurgency led by a former socialist revolutionary named Alexander Antonov. These were not minor rural riots. This was a full-scale organized war.
Yeah, he built a real army.
Antonov built a guerrilla force known as the Blue Army. At its peak, it numbered around 50,000 fighters. They were tearing up railway lines, assassinating local Soviet officials, and fighting pitched battles.
And their demands were clear.
Right. They were demanding free trade, an end to the grain seizures, and local Soviets completely free from Communist Party control.
And the Soviet government responded with overwhelming force.
Massive force. They sent Red Army commander Mikhail Tukhachevsky with nearly 100,000 troops. They deployed heavy artillery into the villages. They set up concentration camps for the families of the rebels. They even used poison gas, dropping chemical weapons into the forest to flush the guerrilla fighters out into the open. The Tambov uprising was brutally crushed.
We have to look at the objective reality of the class forces at play in Tambov.
Right.
The peasants were fighting the arbitrary power of local requisitioning officials and the extraction of their livelihood. Their grievances were entirely grounded in physical starvation.
Yeah.
However, the peasantry, due to its scattered nature and its relationship to private property, cannot rule independently. The peasant wants to own a plot of land and sell the surplus on a free market.
So if they won...
If they had overthrown the Soviet government, it would not have resulted in a decentralized peasant utopia. It would have meant the total triumph of the counter-revolution.
Right.
It would have meant the return of the landlords, the wholesale slaughter of the remaining working class, and capitalist restoration. The state had to defend itself.
Okay, so the Bolsheviks crushed the rebellion to save the state. But you cannot run a country by permanently occupying your own agricultural heartland with troops and artillery. I mean, the tourniquet was still on.
Exactly. The crisis represented the absolute breakdown of the smychka.
The smychka. Right?
Yes, which is the Russian term for the bond, the fundamental alliance between the industrial worker and the agricultural peasant. The entire October Revolution rested on this social foundation.
Yeah, the Bolsheviks delivered the land to the peasants, but during the Civil War, they took the peasants' grain by force.
And the survival of the revolutionary state now depended entirely on fixing this broken bond. This is the structural crisis that sets the absolute stage for the climax at Kronstadt.
Let us move from the burning villages of Tambov to the frozen Gulf of Finland. We really need to look closely at who the Kronstadt sailors were, and more importantly, who they had actually become by the winter of 1921.
Because it is a huge shift.
Right. In 1917, the Kronstadt garrison was the undisputed spearhead of the revolution. When the provisional government needed to be toppled, the Kronstadt sailors marched. When the Bolsheviks needed reliable, hardcore fighters to defend Petrograd, they called on Kronstadt.
Leon Trotsky described their prestige perfectly. He called them, quote, the pride and glory of the Russian Revolution.
But the men occupying that fortress in March 1921 were not the same men who had occupied it in October 1917.
Not at all.
The veteran revolutionaries, the politically educated, highly class-conscious sailors who had fought the Tsar and overthrown the provisional government, were largely gone. They had volunteered for the most dangerous, lethal fronts of the Civil War. Thousands of them died in combat.
And the ones who survived.
The survivors had been transferred deep into the interior of the country to administrative posts to run the new, sprawling state apparatus. They were replaced by a completely new demographic.
Right.
The new recruits entering the naval base were young, raw peasants drafted directly from the countryside. They came from places like Tambov, from Ukraine, from Siberia.
This demographic shift is the material basis for the entire rebellion. The social composition of the garrison had fundamentally transformed.
Yeah.
These new recruits were receiving desperate letters from their families back in the villages describing the requisition attachments, the starvation, and the heavy-handed tactics of local officials.
So the anger just flowed right in.
Exactly. The anger against grain requisitioning had penetrated the military apparatus itself. The peasant war had moved inside the walls of the fortress.
So on February 28, 1921, the crew of the battleship Petropavlovsk held a mass meeting and adopted a sweeping resolution.
And the demands were very specific.
It's very specific. The demands included free and secret Soviet elections, freedom of speech and press specifically for anarchists and left socialist parties, the equalization of rations, and an immediate end to the armed grain requisitioning detachments.
The government tried to negotiate at first, though.
They did. Mikhail Kalinin, who was a senior Bolshevik leader and the nominal head of state, traveled to the island to address a mass meeting in Anchor Square. Picture the scene. Kalinin stands up to speak to a crowd of 15,000 sailors.
Wow.
These are men who, 3 years earlier, would have hung on his every word. Now they shout him down, they jeer at him, they completely refuse to listen.
The breakdown in authority was absolute.
Yeah, the rebellion escalates. The sailors seize control of the entire naval base, taking over the ships, the artillery batteries, and the supply depots. Trotsky issues a strict ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender to the authority of the Soviet Republic.
And they reject it.
The sailors reject the ultimatum. And so, the Red Army begins its brutal assault across the frozen ice. Now wait. Think about this from the perspective of someone reading those demands today.
Right, it can be confusing.
Free Soviet elections. Ending armed grain seizures. Freedom of speech for socialists. That sounds like a democratic program. How does a list of democratic demands constitute a counter-revolutionary threat?
Well, politics is not determined by the subjective desires or the written slogans of the participants. It is determined by objective conditions. Trotsky explained the exact nature of the threat in his later writings. He wrote, quote, "A few dubious anarchists and SRs were sponsoring a handful of reactionary peasants and soldiers in rebellion."
So a few rogue actors were weaponizing the anger of confused peasants.
The political character of the uprising was completely heterogeneous. You had genuine, rank-and-file revolutionaries who were simply physically exhausted and politically confused by the horrors of war communism.
Yeah.
You had anarchists whose political program inherently opposed any centralized state structure. And you had thousands of angry peasant recruits who just wanted the grain requisitions to stop so their families could eat.
But the geography is the real issue, isn't it?
Exactly. The objective truth of the fortress's geography dictated the stakes of the conflict. Kronstadt was the military shield for Petrograd. If Kronstadt fell to anti-Bolshevik forces, the sea lanes of the Baltic would open.
Oh, wow.
It would provide a direct, heavily fortified breachhead for the remnants of the White Armies and foreign imperialist powers to sail right in and capture the former capital of the revolution. The suppression of the rebellion was a harsh necessity to prevent the physical destruction of the workers' state.
And while the artillery was physically shattering the ice at Kronstadt, the 10th Party Congress was convening in Moscow. The dates are March 8th through March 16th, 1921.
Right at the exact same time.
Yeah. You have hundreds of delegates sitting in assembly halls, fiercely debating policy, while they receive daily, bloody casualty reports from the ice. Some of the delegates actually leave the Congress to go physically join the assault on the fortress.
The tension must have been unbelievable.
In this atmosphere of total existential crisis, the Congress makes 3 world historical decisions. The first of these is the implementation of the new economic policy, universally known as the NEP.
Lenin brought forward the proposal for the NEP. The core mechanical shift of the policy was replacing the arbitrary armed grain requisitioning with a fixed tax in kind.
Okay, tax in kind.
Right, this meant the state would calculate and take a set, predictable amount of grain from the peasant. Once that tax was paid, the peasants were legally permitted to sell their remaining surplus grain on the open free market. Lenin explained the nature of this shift in his pamphlet, The Tax in Kind. He wrote, quote, "The tax in kind is one of the forms of transition from that peculiar war communism, which was forced on us by extreme want, ruin, and war, to regular socialist exchange of products. It was not, and could not be, a policy that corresponded to the economic tasks of the proletariat. It was a makeshift."
The policy was a retreat to save the state.
Precisely.
The mechanics of this shift are massive. Under war communism, if a peasant grew 10 sacks of grain, the state might show up and take 8 sacks or 9 sacks, depending on how desperate the local commander was.
Yeah, completely arbitrary.
There was zero incentive for the peasant to grow more than they personally needed to survive, because any extra work would just be confiscated. The NEP changed the formula.
It formalized it.
Now, the state said, we will take exactly 3 sacks as a tax. Whatever else you grow, you can sell for profit. It immediately jump-started agricultural production. But this also completely upends a very specific historical falsification.
Yes, it does.
Later on, a myth was heavily constructed and promoted that Trotsky was a bitter enemy of the peasantry, that he opposed the NEP entirely and wanted to squeeze the villages through extreme forced industrialization.
And the documentary record proves the exact opposite.
Right.
Trotsky actually proposed the core mechanisms of the new economic policy a full year earlier, in February 1920. He had been traveling continuously on his armored train across the country during the Civil War.
So he saw it all firsthand.
He saw firsthand the total economic dead end of war communism. He saw the field sitting empty. He presented a formal proposal to the Central Committee to replace requisitions with a grain tax.
And what happened?
This proposal was voted down 11-4. The party leadership believed they could push through the crisis without reintroducing market mechanisms.
Yet they were wrong.
When Lenin finally proposed the NEP at the 10th Congress, Trotsky supported it completely. He wrote at this moment later, stating, quote, "During the debate at the Congress, I gave warning that the resolution on trades unions adopted by the majority would not live until the next Congress, because the new economic orientation would demand a complete revision of the trades union strategy. I expressed my unreserved approval of his resolution."
He fully backed the economic pivot.
Entirely.
So the first decision made at the 10th Congress was an economic retreat to save the country and repair the smitchko with the peasantry. The second decision was a massive political retreat, and it was formalized in a resolution titled On Party Unity.
Which was huge.
It instituted a total immediate ban on all factions within the Bolshevik Party. Picture the atmosphere of panic in Moscow. The economy is in ruins, the peasants in Tambov are fighting a guerrilla war, the Kronstadt sailors are literally shooting at the Red Army. And inside the ruling party itself, intense, organized internal divisions are forming.
Specifically, groups like the workers' opposition were gaining traction.
Right.
The workers' opposition was led by prominent figures like Alexander Shliapnikov and Alexander Kollontai.
Huh.
They were demanding that the management of the nationalized economy be transferred to the trade unions.
Okay.
They wanted an immediate democratization of industrial management, essentially a syndicalist approach, right in the middle of a collapsing economy.
The Congress leadership, spearheaded by Lenin and Trotsky, felt the party could not survive a divided house. They believed that allowing organized factions with their own platforms, their own internal discipline, and their own meetings would tear the party apart during a civil emergency.
So they acted.
So they banned factions entirely. If you wanted to debate a policy, you could do it as an individual, but you could not form a group to advocate for it. And buried deep within this resolution was a secret provision, paragraph 7.
Ah, yes, paragraph 7.
This paragraph empowered the Central Committee to expel its own members by a 2/3 vote if they were found guilty of factionalism. Think about where you would be in this situation. You are on a sinking ship in the middle of the ocean. The hull is breached. Water is pouring in.
Right.
Banning factions was like sealing the heavy, watertight bulkheads on that sinking ship to stop the flooding from spreading to the rest of the vessel. It was a desperate, immediate survival mechanism.
Yeah.
But they sealed those bulkheads without realizing they were permanently locking the crew inside a shrinking, airless space. Once the bulkheads were closed, no one could get out, and no new ideas could circulate freely.
It was a catastrophic error in the long term. It is understandable given the extreme life-or-death duress of March 1921, but it was disastrous in its consequences.
Yeah.
The World Socialist website provides a very clear, objective analysis of this decision. They state, quote, "Some of the Bolsheviks' measures, such as the banning of party factions in March 1921, a step which Trotsky also defended as a temporary necessity, also contained within them serious dangers for party democracy. As the isolation of the Soviet state continued, the bureaucracy made use of the ban on factions to consolidate its grip on the party."
The temporary shield became a permanent cage.
We have to trace the mechanism of how this destroyed internal democracy. By eliminating the ability of party members to form tendencies, draft alternative documents, and organize around distinct political platforms, the party eliminated the only practical mechanism for resolving political differences democratically.
Because you can't challenge the leadership.
If you cannot organize a group to challenge the leadership's policies, then the leadership becomes untouchable. Power fundamentally and irrevocably transferred from the broad membership of the party directly into the hands of the central party apparatus.
But banning factions created a new logistical problem. If all power was now heavily centralized at the very top of the party apparatus, someone had to actually manage the massive, mundane paperwork of that centralized power.
Oh, the paperwork was immense.
Someone had to keep track of the files, assign the personnel, and manage the daily flow of information. And that sheer bureaucratic necessity created a brand new job title. This is the third world historical decision of the 10th Party Congress.
The General Secretary.
The creation of a newly minted, seemingly mundane, administrative post General Secretary of the Communist Party. The creation of this role was actually initiated by Grigory Zinoviev. No one at the time, not Lenin, not Trotsky, not Zinoviev, thought this job was a pathway to supreme dictatorial power.
No, they viewed it entirely as a technical job.
Right. The party had grown massively. It had hundreds of thousands of members. Someone had to manage the files, coordinate the regional appointments, and handle the daily grinding logistics of the apparatus.
And who did they choose?
The man elected to this new post was Joseph Stalin. Stalin was not known as a grand Marxist theoretician. He was not a dazzling public orator who could command a crowd of thousands in Anchor Square. He was a committee man. He was an organizer who worked behind a desk.
And this seemingly technical post became the primary mechanical lever of bureaucratic dictatorship. We have to walk through exactly how this worked in practice.
Okay, let's break it down.
The position of General Secretary granted almost absolute control over party personnel. Imagine a local party secretary in a province out in Siberia who votes against the central leadership's policies.
Right. They speak up.
The General Secretary notices this in the files. Suddenly, that dissenting local secretary receives a promotion or a transfer to a desk job in a completely different isolated province. The General Secretary then appoints a reliable, loyal replacement to that Siberian post.
And if you do that 1,000 times across the entire country, you completely change the composition of the party.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because those local party secretaries are the ones who select the delegates to the National Party Congresses.
Oh, I see.
And the National Party Congresses are the bodies that vote on national policy and elect the Central Committee. By controlling the local appointments, Stalin controlled the delegate selection, which meant he controlled the voting bodies.
He stacked the deck.
Lenin eventually recognized the immense danger of this concentration of power, but he recognized it too late. In his final writings, evaluating Stalin's new role and his rough, disloyal methods, Lenin warned, quote, "This cook will make only peppery dishes."
The warning arrived too late.
We must maintain absolute theoretical precision regarding this process. Stalin's election to the post of General Secretary was not the sole overarching cause of the degeneration of the revolution.
Right, it's bigger than one man.
The root causes were objective material realities. The total crushing isolation of the Soviet state on the global stage, the physical decimation of the advanced, politically conscious working class, and the sheer unmitigated economic ruin of the country.
If the revolution had spread.
If the revolution had spread to advanced industrial countries like Germany, the material pressure on Russia would have lifted. But the post of General Secretary was the specific subjective instrument used to ruthlessly exploit those objective conditions. The apparatus elevated Stalin because he embodied their desire for stability and control over the volatile masses.
We are looking at a convergence of massive historical forces all colliding in the span of a few weeks in March 1921. While the thick ice of the Gulf of Finland is stained with the blood of thousands of sailors and soldiers, the leadership in Moscow is executing a desperate, high-stakes triage.
Okay.
They retreat on the economic front with the new economic policy to pacify the rebellious peasantry. They suffocate their own internal party democracy by banning factions to maintain an iron united front against total collapse.
Right.
And they hand the keys of the rapidly growing administrative apparatus to a committee man who will eventually use those very keys to lock them all away.
The sheer weight of March 1921 cannot be overstated. The Bolsheviks were not villains, nor were they infallible gods. They were human beings attempting to navigate an unprecedented historical crisis.
Yeah.
They were making life or death decisions under the crushing weight of total isolation, trying desperately to hold the workers' state together just long enough for the international revolution to arrive and relieve them. The NEP, the ban on factions, the elevation of the administrative apparatus, these were all severe adaptations to a highly hostile environment.
Which leaves you with a final thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Think about a biological organism or a political state, adapting purely for the sake of surviving a highly hostile, deadly environment.
Right.
It grows thick armor, it slows its metabolism, it changes its fundamental behaviors just to stay alive for one more day. At what point does the adaptation fundamentally change the nature of the organism itself? Did the heavy armor forged in the desperate fires of 1921 permanently crush the body it was originally meant to protect? We will continue to explore the long-term consequences of these adaptations next time, when our deep dive follows the rise of the left opposition and the ensuing fight for the very soul of the revolution.